All right, guys, in this note set, we are going to talk about cellular energy, right? There are two main organelles involved with cellular energy, and that's the mitochondria and the chloroplast. And there are two main processes, that's cellular respiration and photosynthesis. And we're going to look a little bit at the ATP, all right? We're going to break down what that is a little bit here. All right. So, first, let's review some vocab. Autotrophs. Autotrophs are organisms that make their own food. Some autotrophs use inorganic substances such as hydrogen sulfide, and they're called chemoautotrophs. Um, others convert the light from the sun, and they're called photoautotrophs. Right? Then there are heterotrophs, which are all animals. They are organisms that need to ingest food to obtain energy, right? For most life on Earth, the ultimate source of energy is the sun. All right. Um, so photosynthesis is a reaction in which light energy from the sun is converted to chemical energy for use by the cell, right? Light plus carbon dioxide plus water produces glucose and oxygen, which is quite magical, right? Um, the reactants, the big picture from this is you need to be able to identify the reactants, you need to be able to identify the products. As we've talked about before, the reactants are the things that are before the arrow, the products are the things that come after. All right, so the reactants for photosynthesis are carbon dioxide and water. The products are glucose and oxygen. Light is necessary for the reaction. But they're not usually considered as reactants. So we usually just place it on top of the arrow, or sometimes they leave it out, knowing that you understand that light is necessary. All right. Again, big picture of photosynthesis. Water is absorbed from the roots of plants. Light is absorbed by chlorophyll in the leaves, right? Carbon dioxide enters through the stomata of the leaves, and all of this happens to produce glucose and release oxygen into the air. All right, so plants are extremely important. All right, so the chloroplast is a site of photosynthesis. It has two main parts. The grana, which are stacks of flattened membranes, which are stacked together to form what's called a thylakoid. The light-dependent reactions take place within the thylakoid. The stroma is the fluid-filled space outside the grana, and this is where the light-independent reactions happen, all right, or phase two of photosynthesis. The chlorophyll is the actual pigment that absorbs light and is most abundant in leaves. So roots are not going to look very green because they don't have that many, they don't have any chlorophyll because they're not absorbing light. All right. The structure of the thylakoid membrane, you know, those flattened stacks. I don't know if I said green pancakes. They look like green pancakes to me. Those flattened stacks significantly increase the surface area. And as we've talked about, the structure of something always relates to the function. So what this does is it allows the plants to absorb as much sunlight as possible. Guys, I'm outside, so if you hear any funky sounds, I'm outside. All right. So photosynthesis happens in two steps. Here's the big picture. The first step, you get sunlight and you have water, and the sunlight splits the water molecule to produce oxygen and ATP. All right. The light dependent reactions take place to make ATP because you need ATP to power the dark reactions. All right. Then you have step two, which is the dark reactions, or sometimes you'll hear light independent reactions. And the goal of this step is to make glucose. All right, so I'm going to go in depth a little bit more on those two stages. So again, light excites the electrons in what we call photosystem 2. All right, again, if you can't remember the fine details, remember the big picture. This causes the water to split, right? The excited electrons move from PS2 to an electron acceptor in the thylakoid membrane and eventually transfers it to photosystem 1, PS1. Right? With light present, the electron is transferred to a protein called ferredoxin, which transports it to NADP+, forming the energy storage molecule NADPH. Right? So ATP is not the only molecule that stores energy. Step 2, the purpose of step 2 is to use the energy from the energy carrying molecules from the light dependent reaction. So using the energy from ATP to make the sugar. All right. This part occurs in the stroma, right? And we call this the Calvin cycle or the dark reactions, right? Chemical reactions powered by ATP and NADPH combine hydrogen from water with the carbon dioxide from the air that we got from the stomata to form the sugar molecules, which is glucose. All right. So it uses carbon dioxide and it makes glucose and oxygen as a byproduct. All right. ATP. So we talked about ATP a little bit. So let's dive into it a little bit. So ATP is a storehouse of chemical energy that can be used by the cells in a variety of reactions. Um, for example, the chemical energy in biological molecules is converted to mechanical energy when the muscles contract. So that is the question, like, well, what do you use the ATP for? All right. ATP, we call it ATP. The long form of that is adenosine triphosphate. It is the most important biological molecule that provides energy. So there are a few others that provide energy, but ATP is ultimately the most important. It is a nucleotide. If you guys remember when we did macromolecules, it is made up of an adenine base, a ribose sugar, and 3 phosphate groups. I'm going to try and move my frame. There you go. And 3 phosphate groups. It releases energy when the bonds between the second and third phosphate groups is broken. The goal of cellular respiration is to take ADP and make ATP by adding the phosphate. All right. So here's a little picture of the ATP cycle. So this is ATP or adenine triphosphate, right? Once this bond is broken between these two phosphates, energy is released for the cell. And that energy is energy that you can use to do whatever you need to do, run, jump, throw, grow, whatever you need to do. All right. And so once it is as ADP again, the energy forming processes of photosynthesis and respiration, right? Photosynthesis goes to put the phosphate onto the ADP to turn it back into ATP so that you can have it when you need it. All right, so that brings us to cellular respiration. Again, the main process is cellular respiration, and the main organelle is the mitochondria. All right, so the goal of cellular respiration is to convert chemical energy in food to chemical energy stored in ATP. All right, think of it this way. So glucose is like a check and ATP is like cash. A check, yes, you have the money, but you don't really have it, right? But cash, you have it and you can spend it immediately on whatever you want. All right. The formula for cellular respiration is glucose plus oxygen produces carbon dioxide, water, and energy. And what I want you guys to notice is the formula for respiration is the direct opposite of the formula for photosynthesis. Like all you have to do is turn the arrow around to get the other process. Cellular respiration takes place in the mitochondria. It has two main parts, just like the chloroplast. has an inner membrane which is highly folded, and the purpose of this is to increase the surface area so there's lots of places where ATP can be made. And then we have the matrix, which is a fluid-like substance that fills the space. The first step of cellular respiration is glycolysis. Glycolysis is the breakdown of glucose. Glucose is split in half to form two 3-carbon molecules known as pyruvate. This occurs in the cytoplasm, and this doesn't require energy. So this process itself is anaerobic, right? It produces 2 ATP and 2 NADH, right? And remember, these are both molecules in which we store energy. So after glycolysis, then the cell kind of has to make a decision about what it's going to do. If oxygen is present, then the cell will go through a two-step process known as aerobic respiration. If oxygen is not present, then the cell will go through anaerobic respiration, commonly known as fermentation, in order to obtain energy. All right. So aerobic respiration is preferred because in that way we make the most ATP, right? And we make a total of 30. You'll see numbers between 34 to 38. I typically like to keep it at 36 ATP. So again, the first part of aerobic respiration, so after glycolysis happens, what happens is the next step is the citric acid cycle or the Krebs cycle. This occurs in the mitochondrial matrix. This process involves the two pyruvate molecules from glycolysis, which are chemically converted to make 2 ATP and some NADH and FADH2. Right? This releases carbon dioxide as a waste product. Then we have the electron transport chain, which occurs on the inner membrane of the mitochondria. You have a series of reactions using the electrons and hydrogens formed in the Krebs cycle, and this makes approximately 34 ATP, right, when hydrogen bonds to oxygen. And then this is the actual step where most of the ATP comes from. So the overall process, you'll make about 38 ATP, but that is 2 from glycolysis, 2 from Krebs cycle, and 34 from the electron transport chain. The other options are anaerobic respiration. So if oxygen is not present, then we're going to go through either fermentation or lactic acid. So there are two types of fermentation, lactic acid fermentation and alcoholic fermentation. Alcoholic fermentation occurs in yeast. So when you're baking, yeast releases CO2, which kind of adds air bubbles to your bread, which is what actually causes your bread to rise, right? And the alcohol produced by yeast is used in making beer. Yeah. So thank you, yeast. All right. Lactic acid fermentation occurs in mussels when they run out of oxygen, right? Equation for that is glucose produces lactic acid and 2 ATP. So again, notice that no other process is really giving you this big 38 or 34 molecules of ATP other than aerobic respiration. So aerobic respiration is preferred. When you're exercising really hard, your muscles use up their ATP and oxygen. So the muscles begin to produce ATP through lactic acid fermentation. And that, my friends, is why you feel the burns when you work out really, really hard. All right, so total numbers, ATP, anywhere from 36 to 38 ATP is produced from aerobic respiration. We've got 2 from glycolysis, 2 from the Krebs cycle, and 34 from the electron transport chain. And anaerobic respiration will produce 2 to 4. All right, again, here's the overall processes, and I want you to see that these two organelles sort of need each other, right? The oxygen produced from the chloroplast is used by the mitochondria. The carbon dioxide produced from the mitochondria is used by the chloroplast. And that is it. Made it in 15 minutes. going on here?